Well, a very, very warm welcome to you, Steve. It really is great to have you here. And I read your book, which is called 5 and 20s, Buddy Buddy. Why 5 and 20s?
So 5 and 20s is it's a metaphor. So the book itself is written predominantly for the service, military service, and indeed anybody that is given a life of service, I guess, in that respect, but predominantly for those in the military. Certainly in the Army, but I know now, having spoke to RAF and folk in the Navy, 5 and 20s, certainly in my day, was a standard operating procedure. So if you're on operations, and I'll use Afghanistan as the most recent, and you're travelling out in vehicles, if the vehicle stopped anywhere, although it's an armoured vehicle, you would debus from the vehicle for anything, if you were stopped for anything longer than maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And the moment you debus from the vehicle, you've got to go find yourself a fire position. So a place of cover where you can obviously, keep an eye on the area, situation and that, so for personal protection. So 5 and 20s was a very simple process. Jump out as an individual. I'm going to go and do my 5-meter check. So I'll find a place where I'm going to go into a fire position, and then that 5-meter circumference or perimeter, I'll check for nasties. So I expect as many are familiar with, you would be looking for IEDs, booby traps, and this type of thing. So an IED is an improvised explosive device. Once you've done your 5-meter check, you would then go and join as a team and do a 20-meter check of the whole perimeter. And again, you're doing the same. So you're out there, you're looking for any nasties in there. So once you've done that, you've got a 20-meter perimeter that is fully checked, and then you've got your fire position, which is checked. So the metaphor was a simple one. I'm sure we'll come on to why I wrote the book, but the simple one is the 5-meter check is check yourself. Take a moment and just ask yourself, a few pertinent questions, kind of like, how am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? What's maybe, the cause of if I'm feeling challenged or struggling? And then the 20-meter check is the buddy piece is kind of like, who did you have a conversation with? Who have you identified that maybe they're not quite themselves, or you haven't spoken to for a long time, and reach out. Doesn't need a reason, but it's the buddy piece. And the buddy piece in terms of the military was, again, an unwritten rule of kind of like, you always had your buddy. There's always teamed up with somebody when you were in your unit, and whether that's a section, a team, a platoon, who you look out for each other. So that was the premise of the SOP, and that's the metaphor that I use in the context of that.
So SOP is Standard Operation Procedure.
Right.
I'm learning acronyms. When I was teaching, right, we had lots of people who had military background, and we inevitably ended up with those in school. So every single day we would have DROs, daily routine orders, and it would come in, and I hated it when I first started teaching, because on it would tell you who you were substituting for because somebody was away, which meant you lost your free period. So for me, DROs immediately sets me going, and it doesn't sound great.
Yeah, no, DROs, daily detail, totally understand that.
Let me do this, the 5 minutes. So let me just reflect it back to you. And how are you feeling, and what are you feeling coming into this?
So, well, firstly, I feel quite privileged. Obviously, we met at a networking event, and and again, I know it's a business event, and I should talk about my business. But when I'm given those opportunities, I'll always talk about 5 and 20s because it's a personal mission that I'm on. So I feel privileged that you've offered me and invited me along to the podcast. I think that's amazing. And I always feel quite excited. I'm a positive, driven individual. So I've had a good drive up here, reflecting on the opportunity to talk about the book. So yeah, good.
Okay, good. Well, I've been looking forward to it. I must admit, I have been looking forward to it, only because obviously I read your book and went through it in a lot of detail, then kind of searched in my brain about what am I going to do and what is it I want to do. And I guess the biggest thing, and let me start here, is I want to understand the genesis of Steve. Like, where did you grow up? And we'll talk about your earlier life and what you actually did. So where did you grow up?
I'm Newton Abbot, born and bred.
Okay.
Mum and dad had a started off working, and then they had a business, a kitchen business, and then in the mid-80s that hit hard times. I think when many businesses did, and in the recession back then, before I joined the army. Yeah.
So was that, Steve, just on your own? Do you have brothers and sisters?
Sister, Marina, she lives over in Perth.
Okay.
In Australia.
Perth, in Australia.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
She's been over there. She's an Australian citizen now.
Beautiful place.
Oh,
Absolutely
yeah.
beautiful.
Well, to be
place.
fair, we haven't visited yet. She moved about the same time that I started the business, and to head across to Perth, I've got to take at least a month out of the business, and I've got quite a lot of fingers in pies and lots that we're doing. So it's a little bit more challenging, but we've got plans. We've got plans to get across there.
Could I really encourage you as much as I possibly could? Not only would you get to catch up with your sister, but Perth is the most beautiful place. I was very fortunate. I lived and worked and lived in Australia for about 5 years, and
wow.
both of my kids have now emigrated to Australia. Right, my daughter went a couple of years ago, and my son's been out there about 14 years. So I have such a strong association, and I did spend time when I was doing a big event, and I used to run events all around Australia, travelling all the time.
There's definitely an element of going across there, because my sister's partner, he's more or less my brother-in-law, really, Marcus. Firstly, he has a business which I coach him in the business, and secondly, we've got a business venture together that we're both working on, which is at some point going to cross the divide between here and Australia.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's almost certainly a journey across there.
I mean, it's just, the only thing that's a downside, it's a long way away.
And that's why I think I need a length of time to be across there.
You do. And also, even just travelling from anywhere in Australia to get to Perth is a long time. When I got in an aeroplane, I could not believe how long it took, like nearly 3 hours to go from where I was in Melbourne up to Perth. And I'm looking out the window all the time in the aeroplane thinking, if we got in an aeroplane here and flew for 3 hours, where would you end up?
Central Europe.
You know,
or New York.
You'd end up in Russia.
Yeah.
Most likely. So if we go back and you look back upon, do you look back upon that kind of growing up in Newton Abbot and school? Do you look upon that with affection?
With affection. It's interesting. Never been asked that question. I had I didn't have a particularly special childhood in any way, and I don't mean that in a derogative manner. I went to school. There were challenges, living through my mum and dad losing the business. That was quite challenging. But again, at the time, I was just about to join the army. As a young lad, life was simple. You did school, you got in trouble, you went out, you played down the woods. It's very complex nowadays. Whereas, the friends that I've got, pretty much my best friend is still my best friend. I'll probably end up talking about him later, Sean. But I take Sean to a veterans breakfast every week because he joined the army as well. But yeah, I left school, and at 16 and a half, I was joining the army. So there's nothing I would say that was remarkable or stand out, other than the fact that, I think probably like the vast majority of kids, I went through school, I had good mates, I got into trouble, I was bullied a little bit here and there.
You weren't physically bullied, were you?
Oh, God, yeah.
Were you?
Yeah. You got into a few fights, but you tried to avoid them. I mean, I was a young lad, so the school, had probably 2 or 3 who you would turn around and say were kind of like, you try to avoid, I'm not playing bullying down, by the way. I've got kids myself, and I've seen them go through school, but it was the 70s and the 80s. It was just unremarkable. That was the life that we were living.
It was rife.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was rife. It was you got up to hijinks. Every now and again, you said something or did something that would annoy somebody else, and then they would, and there was a hierarchy in the playground. Let's put it that way. I didn't go into school fearful of being bullied every day. That wasn't what I was. What wasn't the case. I think, I'm 6'3". I was tall at school. Sometimes the smaller guys wanted to have a look at the taller guys. So it was the way of things. It wasn't like some of the stuff you see today, where bullying has been taken to a whole new level, insofar as the digital world. We didn't have any of that. The vast majority of it was just good fun. You learned some stuff. It turns out that I was pretty good at art and quite creative, and ended up going to art college just before I joined the army.
Whereabouts?
In Torquay.
Okay.
So I used to have the art college.
Oh yes, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I used to have a massive college there. All been dropped and taken down, and flats put up instead. But yeah, I studied combined art there, and then ended up leaving that course early to join the army.
Okay. So can I ask, in terms of that, I mean, are your mum and dad still about?
Dad died 13 years ago when I joined or started the business. Pretty much 30 days after I started the business, he passed away with a brain tumour. And my mum, she's still going.
God, that must have been a huge shock and difficult for your mum.
I think it was difficult all round for the family, but definitely, a challenging time for mum, yeah.
She'll watch this with lots of affection though, won't she?
Oh, I expect so. She
so.
follows a lot of the stuff that I do on social media and that, so she seems pretty proud of what I've been doing.
I think she's, I would guess, and I have never met her, I would imagine that she's inordinately proud about what you're doing. Who would you say, if you look back and you were younger, who was the biggest influencer, her or your dad, in terms of you as a person?
That was a 70s family. Mum was a safe pair of hands. You didn't, muck about with dad. So what I learned was the balance between right and wrong. And I also learned negotiation. I learned I could negotiate with my mum, and then she would negotiate with dad. So,
okay.
I wouldn't say one or the other was really the influential point. And I think there was a point, for me as a young lad, very atypical, as a family unit, if that makes sense.
Okay. So I'm now trying to imagine Steve at 16, right, you've left school and now you're going to join the army. Where did you go?
So it's an interesting one, because when I was young, I actually wanted to join the police force, and then I found out very quickly that I wasn't quite gifted enough in the English language department. And so I went down to Torquay Careers Office to join the army. I went in off my own accord because I was up at the college, so it's easy just to wander down. They taught me through it. You end up going and doing, at the time, it was called the domino test. It literally was just like matching numbers and doing a few little tests, and then from that they were able to derive, where you could work within the army. So I did the domino test, and it came out. At that point, I was thinking, I'll go for the RMPs, the Royal Military Police. And in retrospect, I'm thankful that didn't quite turn out. And if you're service and watching this, you'll understand that. And if you're RMP and watching this, I apologise. Okay. But yeah, so I did the domino test. I got offered a few different things, and I kind of found that the infantry was what I wanted to go into. Now, 1985 is literally, a couple of years after the Falklands War, so there's been a lot of influx of folk in there.
Okay.
The infantry, initially, I was kind of like, I want to go to the Parachute Regiment, which again, probably many, many young lads do the same, or the Marines. They weren't recruiting for obvious reasons, probably saturated. So I ended up going to selection up at Sutton Coldfield, where you do a few exercises, a bit of a run and that. And it's where I kind of realised, actually, I didn't realise just how fit I was, And I think that's the life of, as a young kid, just mucking about down the woods and being out and about and active. Mm-hmm. Didn't realise how that has a positive impact on you. So I ended up being given a leaflet for what was and what it still is the Queen's Division.
Right.
And there are 3 regiments, or there were 3 regiments in the Queen's Division, which were the Royal Anglicans, the Fusiliers, and the Queen's Regiment. And I picked a cap badge. I chose the Queen's Regiment. The cap badge had a dragon in the middle of it, plumes at the bottom, honeysoaked Kumali pants, which was Latin for, ill on him who thinks ill of it, and never looked back. So I ended up going to basic training in Bassingbourn, 6 months, where they drill you and shape you as a soldier, and then joined my unit in Canterbury.
So incredibly formative, though. Just talk me back and through. So here we are, Steve, day one, or how did you get there? How did you travel? What did you experience? What was that journey like? Tell me about what actually
Well,
happened.
firstly, I was wearing probably, excuse my French, the most shit 1980s suit. I think actually in today's standard, you could have probably rubbed the phone on it and have charged it. But no, I think it was. I think at the point that I was, the whole family stood there waiting for me to jump onto the train, and I'm all dead smart with my suit and that, and I can't even remember what bag I had. It's probably a suitcase of some description with minimal belongings in there. And yeah, you're all bravado and everything until I sat down on the train. And thankfully, there was another guy I was traveling with, a guy called Chris, who joined the same day. We were traveling up to Basingbourn now, up to Royston train station. And as the journey went on, because it's a few hours in the train, as you got closer, the kind of like conversation stopped. And you start to feel that apprehension, which is fear. And that was well warranted, because I can remember getting off the train, and it's kind of like, may feel a little bit cliche today, but this is what they did. The corporals were on the station, and they were picking out the soldiers, who obviously we standed out very easily in terms of you had a suitcase and looking very smart. And they would say to you, kind of like, are you heading up to Basingbourn? And that was the last time they were polite to you. Because the moment you said yeah, it was then no uncertain terms, F and Jeff, and that's the coach, get across there, double away. I didn't know what double was at the moment. And so when they then started shouting, run, and you got your bag in thinking, oh my God, what am I doing? And then you are, literally, it's shock or capture, and then into training. So yeah,
it's quite interesting, because I can only imagine that, and your description is lovely, and also would be real, but also as you're describing it, I'm sure it regenerates some of those emotions on your part about what was going on and actually what was actually happening, because your system is on high alert. You're now talking about 5 and 20. At that moment, for seconds, you were absolutely in the highest alert mode you possibly could.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
You were being attacked, and you felt like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that the services does incredibly well, and I hope that they don't. I hope they don't dilute what basic training is all about.
Okay.
Which there is the risk that's happening nowadays. Unlike any other job, and maybe slightly detraction from what we're talking about, but unlike any other job that requires people to put their life on the line, and I think I bring the police into this. We're training people to go to battle at the very, very, doesn't matter what way you want to look at it. But at the cutting edge of this, if you want to put it at grassroots, we're training people to go to battle.
But the veneer of uniform and the necessity and so forth paints not the right picture at all, because if we look at it, and you're right, the base level is we need people, and some of those people will go to places and won't come back.
You're right, and I think that's what I mean. So basic training needs to be something where we're able to actually, take somebody. The easiest phrase I use is when we have a personal weapon, you always used to say you strip your weapon down for daily cleaning and put it back together again. A fully serviceable weapon, and it's the same that you do with a person individually. It's kind of like you strip them down for daily cleaning, you put them back together as a soldier. And that does mean, in some respects, you strip away elements of their identity. You don't strip their identity completely by any shape, but you're educating them in terms of you are now part of a mechanism. And in the course of time, don't forget this is basic training. In the course of time, once they live, understand, and can follow instructions and take orders, that's probably the key point here. They then start to learn the thinking process that comes behind it, which is the modern services that we live in. But in order to do that, you've got to have a real recognition and understanding of what it is to be in service. It's not called the services because you're going out there and doing what you want to do. It's in the services because it is in the service of others. That's what we do, whether that's support to the civil community or whether it's actually out on the front line in Afghanistan.
It's interesting actually, because I went to school close to the Lympstone Marine Camp, and so I'm quite familiar with it. And I could talk to Scotty when he was here right, about getting the train from Exeter and stopping at the Lympstone Halt, which is specifically for the Marine camp. And I was kind of aware about what happened because we as kids growing up had mums and dads who had kids at our school, and they were actually at the Lympstone camp. And one of the things that they did was to talk about what actually happened. And I can imagine the first time they ever walked in and being met and the greeting and everything else like that, which must have been quite a shock.
I can remember, just even part way through the training when you get like you got a couple of weeks or you got a week's leave, and I can remember going home and my mum and dad were in shock at how much I'd changed and how confident I'd become. And then when I finished that and got to the unit, literally, got to the unit, and then within a couple of months we were on a Op Cara Cara tour of Northern Ireland down in South Armagh and County Down. And again, the confidence that training instills in you, and then continued training. Because if you're not on operations, you're always training for operations. That is the life of a soldier.
Okay.
And there's a whole range and plethora of different training. Adventure training, weapon training, physical training. You are constantly training, unless you're on operations, in which case you're constantly on and delivering.
What was the reaction of your peer group, your mates who you went to school with and grew up with when you first came home?
I think in the early days I was kind of like that level of confidence, it changes who you were. So the Steve that they'd seen when I'd left and gone to college and then departed for training wasn't the Steve that came back. At the root level, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about it. At the root level, I've always been Steve. That's my identity, my true behaviours inside, and how they've grown. But when I came back from training, it was the confidence. I just had. I was more. You might say in those days I was cocksure.
Okay.
I stood up. I didn't slouch. I had my neck in the back of the collar.
Right.
My shoulders were held back. I was confident. And to be fair, if you would have seen me at that age, you'd kind of like, well, you still look like a little boy. But
Did your mates, do you think, dislike that or liked it or didn't just connect with it at all?
No, I to be fair, I don't think it had much of an impact. And if I'm brutally frank, I didn't stay in touch with them that much after I left school. Yeah, the one guy that I really did stay in touch with was Sean, my best mate. And even then, that was very, very sporadic because he joined the army a little while before me and gone into the Royal Corps of Signals. But the guys and girls that I knew from school, I didn't stay in touch with. To be fair, I think when I was coming home on leave once I got to unit, actually there were a couple of guys that were recruited from the same area, which was quite strange in its own right. They were who I hung around with. And then we had friends from around the country that, because we lived in the English Riviera, they would, oh, okay, we're going on leave. All right, okay, we're going down to Steve's. And they'd come down to Torquay.
Right.
So, yeah, it was, I think it was just, part of my journey, really, to be fair.
Okay, if I go back on that journey and just reflect for a moment and think about it, we talk about your mates, your peer group, and the people who are around you. And the fact is that you became disassociated with them. You didn't actually connect with them in the same sort of way or sustain or maintain those relationships. If you look back on you and the formative and becoming Steve and growing up Steve, are there particular teachers who you can remember? And I ask this because I used to be a teacher myself. Are there any teachers that you remember?
I think there was, I remember the Mr. Rawston, the PT.
Okay.
Again in the day, I can relate now, having gone through the military training and done the PTI stuff. I can that he would have done well in the army himself. And I can't remember if he was ex-military himself, but I can remember the PT side of life. I can remember a guy, Mr. Hutchinson, who was just a real people person and really engaging and made learning fun. He did general science, and that was, I think he did general science. That was really good fun. I remember him.
Do you think they were big influences upon you, Steve, the person?
I think every teacher, in some respects or other, would have influenced that growth as a young child. But again, I think this is where the military does a really good thing. You know, the 6 months that I went into service and did my basic training, when I look at it, you know, Sergeant Bonapong, who was my platoon sergeant, was an influence. He was an army boxer. Remember, you know, my section commander, major influence, very stiff in the back, very point. You know, he was a real, well, I mean, he was my first corporal, so it's kind of like, you know, you look to everything for your corporal. And it's kind of fascinating now. My daughter's joined the service, and she's just currently now you know, a training instructor at Purbright. So she is a corporal doing that very job. And it's really interesting talking to her from that side of it now, where she can see the impact that she's having on these young minds.
Right.
So I think I'm a combination of multiple different people I've met along the way, but I wouldn't say, I'd say collectively school helped to create who I was. I think there was probably more influence from mum and dad. Dad was very much a disciplinarian, you know, and again, you know, I don't, right or wrong, whichever way you want to look at it, worked for us. You know, you could wind mum around your finger a little bit and she'd do the negotiation with dad. And then he'd let, you know.
It's fascinating, isn't it, in families, this relationship, though, the negotiation role of mums.
It's the dynamic, isn't it? It's the dynamic of a family. And I think, you know, when I look at myself and Sam and our two kids, you know, we're very much similar to that, although I think there's less need for a negotiation between us, you know. But Sam, their mum, you know, she was always kind of like, they would default to mum if they wanted to ask dad something. And then she would always say, just ask your dad. And then they'd come up and ask me, and I'd always surprise them, kind of like, you know, being a bit gruff, and then tell them they could have it. It's the game you play.
Okay.
But part of parenting, you don't, you know, you do the best you can, I think, as parents, and I can recognise that with my mum and dad. And then just
I couldn't agree more. There's no manual. Nobody teaches you. Nobody shows you how to do it. And
not at all.
And yet, I think there are lots of people, frankly, from my experience, who are desperately to get help and support of various types.
I think today there are more complexities in the world that we live in that make it so difficult, and it's so judged. You know, as a parent, you're judged, or you feel judged. You know, in the world that we live today. So I think there's a lot. You know. Yeah, there's a lot more difficulty, I think, you know, today being a parent and how you go about doing that. And, you know,
the one thing I would say, and I will say this because publicly I would say it to everybody, you have to love your kids unconditionally.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
No, but you say, oh, yeah, people don't.
And I understand that. I've seen it. I mean, you know, one thing you get in service is you get a real taste for humanity. The places that I've been, the things that I've seen, you know, nobody should have to witness and experience that stuff. So I know what it is to love your kids.
Yeah. I think, actually, I can only reflect, and I can reflect in my kind of older age, if you like, that I talk to my kids every single week. I have a FaceTime conversation with my kids, and the conversation, and that conversation is not important to them. It's important to me. It's mutually important and critical communication. And about understanding where they are, what they're doing, and what they're involved in is so good and so important. And I used to spend my time trying to often pick up the pieces in families, and the one thing that breaks almost instantly is the communication. The inability to share. Life becomes a big secret, and they're hiding. I used to have parents who would sit in my room because their kid had been in some sort of difficulty. So I'd say, well, they finished school, and then what do they do? I don't know. I've no idea. So I said, what do you mean? Your kid left school at 3:30 or whatever it was, and you mean they didn't come back until what time do they get in the evening? Like 10 or 11 o'clock. So what have they been doing between 3:30 and 10 or 11 o'clock at night?
Wow.
You've got no idea.
And that's the thing. We had a discipline back from you left school, you went home, you had a snack, you went out to play, and not in your school uniform. You had to get changed. And if it was raining, you didn't go out to play, and then you were like
like a bear with a sore head.
Oh, you were trapped. you know, pacing around the place. You know, so I think again, there's the, you know, our kids grew up and there was the start of the digital and the gaming and all that type of stuff. But we're pretty grounded, and I think like you, we, you know, every week we have a conversation with my son and his wife, with my daughter, We have our own little WhatsApp group now where
Yeah,
we share
yeah.
and take the mickey out of each other, and you know what you're doing and
We
how's
do
your
the
day.
same thing all the time.
Amazing, you know. So, you can say that technology, and I have said it, that you know is making more complexities, also helping the communication side of life. So
If you use it well,
yeah,
it can help and support.
I guess if you use it as the original design, really.
I think if you send photographs and you exchange what's going on and live into the complexity of their lives and then get engaged and involved, because I've got grandkids now who are sort of 17, 18 and growing up
Yeah.
and finding their way in the world, you become involved in their world as well. But I would say this to you in anticipation, and I don't know what the compensation is, but they're in Australia and I just miss them. I miss physically seeing them. May sound silly, but I do.
No, I don't think it sounds silly at all. My son and his fiance, they've been travelling the world for the last 2.5 years.
Right.
They're all the way, through the Far East. Then they went and worked in Canada for 2 years, and then they got married over there, which was a real bonus because we all shipped across to Canada for their wedding.
Okay.
Got married on a lake called Bow Lake.
Yeah.
Up Banff,
Yeah.
frozen lake.
I know where it
Amazing.
is, yeah. I know.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely
been.
amazing.
Go on.
And then we came back, and literally they've been back in the UK now probably about 4 or 5 weeks. Both got jobs, both sorted themselves out. They live up in Sevenoaks. My daughter's in Pirbright, on a corporal's tour. So yeah, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, but I think it's nice to be involved and the warmth that you feel about that
Mm.
and the pride that you feel from that. You couldn't put a measurement scale around it, could you? You couldn't quantify it.
No.
And I don't think they know, and we don't often say enough. We don't often. I mean, I watch and look at the styles and so forth. If I look at my style of upbringing and involvement. So, for example, I have to, as soon as I see Tom, my son, and my daughter, I have to hug them. I have to physically hug them.
Oh, I'm a hugger.
Yeah. It's really important. But I never got hugged as a kid, certainly not by my dad. It was a million miles away. My mum was much more affectionate, but my dad was a million miles away. In fact, to some extent, I think he was quite an isolated and kind of a lonely creature in pain himself, because latterly in life, I watched him go through all the pain of actually things falling apart. He was an alcoholic. And I knew what was going on. And it was the first time in my life that I've ever come up against realization on my part. Didn't matter what I did, didn't matter what I threatened, didn't matter what I said, it wasn't going to change his behavior. The only person who was going to change his behavior was himself. And I think actually one of the things that I've learned over the years is this thing about behavior, particularly when I was involved in dealing with kids and disruptive kids. You will not change the behavior of kids who are badly behaved or highly disruptive, in fact involved in criminality or whatever else it may be. You will not change it by threats or by punishments. You will not change it. The only way you're really going to change it is by changing your behavior and your response to it. And it's being conscious about what it is that you do and how you behave. I think in lots of ways the dynamic of behavior from one person to another is one of the things that absolutely fascinates me, because we all respond to how we felt. And that actually is what encouraged me to want to write a book, which the title was The Only Behavior You Control Is Your Own. And yet we shouldn't go around trying to change lots of other people, but recognize we have to change our behavior if we're going to change that.
The premise of that today is you, in order to do that, it's interesting, that I often talk about holding the mirror up, the 5 meter check, looking at and holding it and then asking, why am I feeling, doing, behaving the way I'm feeling, doing and behaving? And for the vast majority of people, they'll drift through life without ever asking that question. That's just who I am.
I used to actually run events and give people mirrors. I used to say, here's a gift from me to you. Here's a little mirror. Put it in your pocket. And it was only a little tiny little mirror. So put it in your pocket and take it out and occasionally and look at it and just recognize who you are and how you're behaving and what you're actually doing. Because I think you're absolutely right. And I think in terms of development and that development, the continuous kind of life development, the ability to self-reflect is so critical.
Well, life's a mirror, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
When you look at the mirror, it's kind of like that's what you're getting when you the reflection is what you're getting back in life. And it's also the fact that you're kind of like when you look into the mirror, it's kind of like who do you want to see back?
Mhm.
What are the challenges, the cracks, the traits that you kind of you're not happy with that you want to change? And it's picking up on that dialogue, that narrative, and then doing something about it.
Mhm.
Which I think there are so many, I think factors that can have a negative and positive influence on that. That it's kind of peer pressure and society and today we're belt fed negativity and news. Woe is me. The language that we're talking about today, and kind of like the need for individuals to be recognised, in one way or another, I think is when you look at it in that respect, it's kind of like, that's taking self to a point where you don't recognise anybody else.
I think actually you raise a really important thing, which is, and I believe very strongly, language is the forerunner of change.
Mm-hmm.
And the language that people are using now is so inflammatory and defamatory in the way that it's issued, the hate that's about, and the language which people are using is appalling.
But the challenge, I think the interesting point with the language is it's the language you don't hear. It's the narrative and the conversation that goes on between your ears.
Yeah.
That and that's where you've got to first start. And in some, for me as a coach, that is absolutely where I'll go in terms of what your thought,
what your internal
are.
mechanisms are actually doing. What's the thought process? What are you actually?
Yeah.
And people
your
say
your belief structure,
but also only because people see it as very touchy-feely. How are you feeling and what's going on? People don't have a language which sometimes is able to express what it is that they're actually feeling. They don't have the language to be able to do it. I mean, one of the subjects which we won't go to at this particular stage, which I feel so strongly about, is the lack of development about language, particularly about dealing with subjects like death. People don't talk about it because they don't have any words, or suicide. They don't have any words, right? And they say things like, oh, he passed away. Where did he go? What happened? He died. What happened? What were the circumstances and so forth? And we don't actually have language which encapsulates that.
Well, today we live in a world where language has been weaponized. And I think, you asked me about my childhood and it was non-eventful. I was a young lad. I grew up as a young lad. I mucked about. I got in trouble. I got into fights. There's nothing dramatic about that over the, for me personally. I then joined the army, and the army shaped a lot of who it is and how I sit here today. But the interesting point is how I formed all of those synapses links in my brain and how I grew as I went.
Right.
That's what shaped me. Is this stage of maturity? As I grew. So as you grow up, you learn different things. You reflect back on things that you've done. You look at actually understanding right and wrong. Because some stuff that you do wrong as a young kid, as a young testosterone-filled teenager, is funny. It's laugh. It's a joke. But then when you grow up and you look back and you think, that's just wrong. Why did we do that? And it might have been, I don't know, going and breaking something.
Or knocking on someone's door.
Knock
or running
Ginger,
away.
yeah. I mean, and those type of things was funny, but you didn't know who lived in the house, But so as you grow and you mature, you start to recognize and realize that there are, that your behaviors have consequences. Whereas today now, I think there's so much more insular focus for individuals and a need to be, wanted and liked. The social media aspect of things is driving such an addictive nature in people where they feel anxiety if they don't get a thumbs up for a comment.
It's a dopamine hit.
Well, the chemicals that we talk about there in terms of your endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, the two that are most important in terms of us as human beings is serotonin and oxytocin. They're the ones that we talked earlier about. I'm a hugger because it makes me feel good, and I know it makes the other person feel good. I know it's good being a part of a tribe. We're a herd creature. Yeah, we're now driving a more insular, society. If you walk down the street, people aren't looking around smiling at each other. They're looking at a small 2 by 6 inch screen, and they're not even looking where they're going.
No.
There's an extrasensory perception of the direction that they're heading, and every now and again they look up to make sure they haven't walked into the road. I mean, it's ludicrous, how that digitization is having an impact. And then when you start to look at, the endorphins are driven by that activity. From our early ages, it's kind of like, you get the endorphin hit after you've ran to go and, capture your dinner, or you've gone and grabbed an apple or something, and then the dopamine hit is kind of like coming after you've had it to get more of it because it's sustained. Well, now with belt feeding,
right?
So we're getting so much, of a dopamine hit that it's having an adverse effect.
There was an
because we become
article.
addicted.
There was an article in the paper, which I read last weekend actually, which was about infinite scrolling and how the design of those sites are put together to keep you scrolling down the
100%.
screen all the time. You become utterly, and people
And at what?
at what they don't actually recognize it as an addiction. They stand there scrolling, and actually infinite scrolling is built in to the way that those things are put together.
Just as a side on it, there is a whole context of kind of like, if you find yourself do that, create safe space. Don't have your living room where you don't have your phone. Where's your phone when you go to sleep? The vast majority of people, it's on the side.
Yeah.
They charge it on the side of their bed.
Yeah.
And because they charge it on the side of the bed, what do they pick up first thing in the morning? Phone. They say if you're an alcoholic, you'll pick a can of beer up first thing in the morning. Just think about that for a moment.
Yeah, you do.
If you're picking up your phone first thing in the morning, what are you doing? Are you looking for those international texts that you've had from around the globe over the night? It's an addiction. So for one thing that I try to do at least once a year is to have a digital detox.
Right.
We're going on holiday in a couple of weeks' time, and the mobile phones will be switched off.
Good. Well, on that note, I think we've come to the beginning of our conversation. It's been really, really enjoyable. Thank you very, very much. We'll take a bit of a break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more, if that's okay.
Look forward to it.
Okay, good. Thank you. I've enjoyed that. That's been really good. Well done.